This lecture is one of four related to an introductory lab in dynamic systems and controls on introducing Arduino usage. And it's understood that many of you may have used Arduino in the past. So really this is just a quick introduction to how we used Arduino in this lab course, but also discussing how it sort of fills the need for introducing measurement and sensor usage. And of course, in this particular lab, there's some basic experiments that we do with the Arduino to get everybody sort of on the same page. So in these series of lectures, I'll also talk about some of the pre-lab exercises and the lab evaluation associated with these lectures. So in this first lecture, I'd like to introduce the idea of measurement systems because it allows us to talk about sort of the general idea of how we put together systems for making measurements from all kinds of engineering and physical systems. We use a general idea of a system, drawing power from it, and that measurement system is what's of interest to us. So this is actually in the area of, say, measurement science. People talk about these terms, and it's kind of good to know these in case you ever hear about them again. So I use very specific sort of symbols here in this little cartoon here. The measurement system is this box. I break that down into a couple of different important elements down here, and note that I use power bonds, these power bonds to represent, well, there's power coming from the system here. And remember, this represents power going both ways. There's a system that acts as a sensor. This might also have some power coming into it. That sensor system generates some sort of signal, and that also could be in some power electrical signal, say. It doesn't have to be electrical, but typically it is, and we'll talk about the types of sensors that we most often use are electromechanical, so this usually becomes an electrical signal. And finally, there's an important box here that we put in signal conditioning, and we'll confine that to talk about circuitry, physical circuitry. But then there's also a lot of stuff that goes on over here that I'll mention, like processing and control and modern measurement systems rather incorporate all of these pieces now, a lot of them into a single element. So talk a little bit about that too. A couple of different terms that might be of interest to you. Referent usually refers to something that you're trying to, in the system itself, that you're trying to pick up information on. So it's some kind of attribute that you're interested in. It could be related to a state variable in the context of dynamic systems. A measurand is a specific referent that actually is also measurable. Not everything that we care to know something about, right, is measurable. So sometimes what we can measure can tell us something about, a particular referent. Finally, at the very end of it, information is what we hope to build out of this, right? And it's the content that's embedded in any kind of signal, and we're trying to pull that out, right? So that's kind of a big picture on what measurement science. There's whole books and sometimes a whole courses designed around these ideas, and you review all kinds of sensors, signal conditioning, and ways of processing data. Here in this course, we're integrating all of that into various labs, right, to give you a really quick introduction. Moving on to sensors, again, most of the type that we'll be looking at in this course are electromechanical. And that means that we're trying to measure some quantity, some referent, right, something that's measurable, and convert it typically into an electrical signal or quantity that we can then infer something about what we're trying to measure. What's interesting is that many of the types that we are interested in using, and I have some figures over here. We can categorize them into resistive, capacitive, inductive, and electric in terms of electrical types of. There's also another that's piezoelectric that's sort of kind of capacitive. But if you think about it, these are like our R, our C, and our I elements in a sense that you are learning about in the lecture part of this course, right? The resistive, capacitive, and inertive, if you like, elements also can be used to think about sensors. So there's resistive sensors for example, like strain gauges and potentiometric type devices. There's capacitive sensors that use change in capacitance to infer something, and inductive usually use, we're looking at some change in inductive or sometimes magnetic properties. And finally, piezo is a slightly different. It's more of a crystal, say like a ceramic crystal, and it's sort of piezo means change in pressure, so that we can get a sort of a change in stress or pressure, say, and we can infer something about a quantity. And these are used in all sorts of devices: accelerometers, force sensors, pressure sensors, all kinds of stuff. All right. Resistive sensors are relatively easy to configure, and so they're nice and easy to use, and we'll be using some of them in this course. And there's things like photocells. All of these, right, we can actually, when we want to represent them in a circuit, the nice thing is we can always represent them in the typical sort of resistive type element. So the idea is that, yeah, there's some resistance here, right, some R, but it's changing, right? So sometimes you've seen it probably designated this way. So some quantity here is changing the resistance. So let's say this is some variable X. So R is a function of X, and that X could be something that you're interested in measuring. It could be the amount of light on it, or it could be strain, it could be temperature, or it could be some distance, right? So all of these different kinds of resistive sensors work the same way. That quantity changes the resistance value. And as you know, by putting it in a like I said, these are simple to use, or relatively simple, because you can put them in a simple kind of potentiometric circuit, right? Let's say this R2 here, or R1, one of those could represent the resistance of that sensor. By putting it into a simple voltage divider this way, you can measure then the output. And then this is an example of a signal conditioning circuit, right? You don't want to necessarily measure the resistance directly, but you can measure the voltage drop across it, or the current through it, say. Either way, really, voltage is much easier to measure, right, using devices like an Arduino, as we'll talk about later, because we have analog to digital converters that can make an estimate of voltage, right? And typically we don't measure things like current or resistance or capacitance directly. We need some kind of signal conditioning to do that, convert it into a voltage, and then we can make some inference about what that quantity is. All right. So resistive sensors, the reason they're very popular is because they're easy to use, simple signal conditioning. The thing is, remember, resistors also generate heat, and they're purely dissipative. So all the power that you put into them, right, all the electrical power that goes in, right, is lost in heat. And so, they're power consumptive. So they're not always, and sometimes they can have other disadvantages, but sometimes cost and ease of use is very desirable, and sometimes they're widely available as well. Many modern sensors are built using MEMS technology, or these are micro electromechanical devices, right? They're basically built on chips and out of silicon. So a lot of different types of devices now are made this way, and certain basic mechanisms, sensing mechanisms, are built, and then they're used to construct other types of sensors. So like, take the classic idea of an accelerometer. All accelerometers are built in this really kind of old little figure here. You have a mass, and we'll talk about accelerometers later in this course, but this is typically referred to as a seismic mass. It responds to the motion at the ground that you might be attaching this device to, and usually you have something that you can call a spring and something you can call a damper, so that you can configure it as a mass spring damper system. And so this responds, and this seismic mass, its motion relative to the case is typically detected through some kind of sensing mechanism. It could be a displacement device or so on. So nowadays, so these used to be built quite literally as masses with springs on them. They're bulky then, and some are still built that way. Nowadays, most of them are built using a MEMS construction, and this is one way. Imagine this is a very, very small device built on silicon, and the same idea here is that you have, um, you can see these structures here kind of are made out of silicon, but they're spring-like. And this whole thing here might be the mass. This is the spring. And so you can build a mass spring system, and then there's some inherent damping in here. So this is constructed all, and then what you're changing now is the capacitance, say, between these little combs, and then you can infer that capacitance and build an accelerometer, right? So the nice thing about doing stuff like this is that you can integrate these really small devices with additional circuitry, or integrate it with other kinds of specialty devices so that you can do processing and so on. And that's how most modern sensors are built. And the low-cost ones that we typically buy are built this way. Indeed, modern sensor systems devices include a lot of circuitry for processing and communications, right? So many of these low-cost sensors that you might buy online and so on, for dollars, say. Sometimes we call them smart because they have a much more complex structure, right? They have, here's the device, that's the sensor, and then you've got a lot of, you have A to D conversion built in, you have filtering, and then you might have other kinds of computing and communication circuits that allow you to and here's a communications protocol that, say, is used very commonly in a lot of systems and on Arduino as well. And so now you can basically talk to this sensor that has this capacity to basically tell you, hey, I just measured some acceleration over here, and this basically now sends out, digital data instead of the traditional way, which might have been measuring the analog signal directly, right? And it makes it a much more efficient way to measure things, and also cost comes way down, okay? And so this is the example of one. You can find many. We'll use some of these in the course as well. This is a diagram that I found some time ago that kind of illustrates how modern sensor systems are built, that I think is kind of a useful kind of principle or idea to think about. Especially because, a lot of times, right, well, a lot of sensors nowadays, at the end of the day, a lot of them have digital data coming out of them that we can read, say, on a bus, like with Arduino. Some of them we might want to read directly the analog voltages or infer current and so on. But this is kind of a neat illustration of how you have, in the course, the 344 course, the dynamic systems of control. We're talking about thinking about systems in general and how you have energy domains and so on. So think about being able to measure things in any physical or chemical domain. And sometimes what you want to do is then use some of these electrical domains to measure that. And so sometimes you take a quantity here and you convert it into one of these electrical domains. Then what happens is you often want to convert it into either a time domain or digital domain signal that you can then measure. So this is kind of a neat little wheel that I saw from this book by Malmstad on electronic measurement. And I wanted to show you some examples of that in the next couple of slides. But the idea is, you don't always expect that you're going to be measuring voltages directly, right? You're going to be, and sometimes it just depends on how a sensor is most efficiently developed and built, or you might even have something available to you that you have to use. And I just want you to be mindful of the fact that you might have sensors where the data that you need to collect is going to be encoded, either in analog form, so it's varying over time, and it changes, in an analog form in terms of its amplitude, or the quantity that you're interested in might actually have a time domain character. So you might be measuring frequency, right, or period between certain events, right? Or again, you might have a digital form that you're measuring, integers or binary type signals that are communicated over a bus. So be mindful of the fact that sensors have, what happens with these devices is they convert into different forms, again, depending on how a device was built. So you might run across many different types of these, and just be aware that you want to look at that if you're ever buying a device or so on. Look at how the data comes out, what form is it in, because that's going to dictate, how you're going to have to measure it, right? You're going to need a measurement system to acquire that data, okay? Excuse me. And so here's a neat little system example that you can look at this more later, but it shows a device like a digital thermometer where, okay, it starts off at temperature, thermistor, say, it converts into resistance. And then from a resistance, you need a signal conditioning circuit that takes you to voltage. And then they have, so here's the thermistors. They put into a Wheatstone bridge, right? That converts it into a voltage. But then they have a circuit that converts it from voltage to frequency. So you see it makes a little jump from voltage to frequency. And then from frequency, you might have some logic circuits that might count, right? Might give you, might have a digital counting circuit or something, or you might read this directly. Now, this is kind of an old figure, but you know, if you ever see a device like this where it just reads something out, it probably has sort of a gating and counting circuit this way. So it's kind of a neat way to think about how sensor systems are built nowadays. Again, even though this little diagram itself is probably about 20, 30 years old. Finally, again, think about measurement systems, and conventionally in a course like this, we like to introduce the acquisition of the data through a data acquisition system. So typically this is computer aided, and we've done a lot of different types. We've used a lot of different types of systems, and you'll see these again in the context of work that you might be involved in. You might have USB devices, you might have other types of specialty buses where you have instruments that are used to measure electrical quantities, or specialty devices communicating with a computer, obviously. These are some older figures I have, but it all still stands the test of time. You might have a specialty rack that might have all the signal conditioning that then goes into a board that, again, this old computer can read. Most of us use something like a laptop nowadays with USB or even wireless communications. So these are all the different types of data acquisition systems, and we used to do this a lot in this course, and I'm going to talk in the next video about how we've transitioned over to just using Arduino for that. But be aware that in a lot of work environments you might go to, you might be asked, go into the lab and there's a data acquisition system there, and then you have to learn a new piece of software that is used to collect data and so on, right?